September 12, 1945, 0800 hours, Camp Henderson, California. When the first group of Japanese prisoners of war entered the mess hall that morning, they encountered a technology so revolutionary, so impossibly advanced, that many would later describe it as witnessing magic itself. The Americans called them iceboxes, but to the Japanese, these humming white boxes would shatter everything they believed about American industrial might and forever change their understanding of what defeat truly meant. The war had officially ended 3 weeks earlier with Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri. But for the 847 Japanese prisoners held at Camp Henderson, the true shock of American superiority was only beginning. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were survivors from the elite Imperial Navy's 14th Special Landing Force, men who had witnessed the devastating power of American bombers and battleships. They thought they understood the enemy's capabilities. They were wrong. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitmore, commanding Camp Henderson's prisoner operations, had been instructed by Washington to implement what military documents called Controlled Cultural Exposure Protocol. The goal was psychological preparation for repatriation, showing Japanese prisoners the reality of American civilian life to facilitate post-war cooperation. What military planners hadn't anticipated was the profound shock these revelations would create. The mess hall at Camp Henderson had been constructed using standard Army specifications, but with one crucial addition that would prove transformative: 6 General Electric monitor-top refrigerators, each standing 7 feet tall and humming with the quiet confidence of American engineering. These machines, manufactured in Schenectady, New York, represented technology that existed in fewer than half of American homes, but would seem like science fiction to men from a nation where ice was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. Sergeant Robert Hayes, documenting the prisoners' integration process, recorded the moment in his daily report. At 8:15 hours, the first group of Japanese prisoners entered the mess hall. Their reaction to the refrigeration units was immediate and dramatic. Several men stopped walking entirely. Others pointed and spoke rapidly in their language. One prisoner, later identified as Petty Officer First Class Yamamoto, approached refrigerator unit number 3 and stood motionless for approximately 4 minutes. The Japanese prisoners had spent months, even years, in tropical conditions where food spoilage was a constant battle. They had witnessed their own forces struggling with inadequate supply lines, where fresh food was a memory and preserved rations were often contaminated. The concept of artificially created cold, sustained indefinitely by electrical power, challenged their fundamental understanding of resource scarcity that had defined their wartime experience. Medical Corpsman William Torres, assigned to monitor prisoner health during integration, noted unusual behavior patterns in his September 12th report. Subjects displayed symptoms consistent with technological shock: elevated heart rates, perspiration despite cool morning temperatures, and what appeared to be involuntary trembling when approaching the refrigeration units. Several prisoners requested permission to touch the machines. To understand the magnitude of what these prisoners experienced, one must comprehend the technological reality they had left behind in Japan. The empire that had conquered much of the Pacific operated on principles of resource conservation that Americans could barely imagine. Ice production in wartime Japan was limited to essential military and medical applications.
Civilian populations had not seen ice cubes since 1942. Captain Hiroshi Nakamura, former supply officer for the Imperial Navy's Third Fleet, provided testimony during post-war interrogations that revealed the stark contrast. According to captured documents, Japanese naval vessels allocated ice production exclusively for medical emergencies and ammunition storage. The concept of using ice for food preservation aboard ships was considered wasteful beyond comprehension. Fresh food spoiled within hours in tropical conditions, leading to widespread malnutrition and disease among Japanese forces. The prisoners at Camp Henderson represented men who had witnessed their empire's gradual collapse through supply failures. They had eaten rice infected with weevils, fish that had rotted in tropical heat, and vegetables that had spoiled before reaching frontline positions. For these men, food preservation meant salt, smoke, and prayer. The idea that Americans could create winter inside a box, sustained by the simple flip of a switch, was beyond their experience or imagination. Private First Class Eugene Morrison, assigned to the camp's kitchen detail, documented the prisoners' first encounter with refrigerated food in his personal diary. They wouldn't believe the milk was real, had to show them it came from the refrigerator cold. One of them, an older guy who spoke some English, kept asking, "How make cold? How make cold?" Couldn't explain it in a way he understood. The technological gap extended beyond simple refrigeration. These Japanese prisoners came from a society where electrical power was rationed, where civilians received electricity for only a few hours daily, and where industrial capacity had been devastated by Allied bombing. They had fought in battles where American forces seemed to have unlimited supplies, while Japanese forces counted every bullet. But seeing unlimited cold, produced effortlessly by machines that required no human labor, forced them to confront a technological superiority they had never imagined. Camp Henderson's medical officer, Dr. Samuel Richards, noted in his September 15th report, "Prisoners continue to exhibit what can only be described as technological paralysis when confronted with refrigeration equipment. Several have requested detailed explanations of the mechanical principles involved. Others appear to believe the machines operate through supernatural means." The psychological impact extended beyond individual shock. These were military men trained to assess enemy capabilities, and they were beginning to understand that their entire conception of American industrial power had been catastrophically inadequate. They had fought believing they faced a wealthy but technologically comparable enemy. The refrigerators suggested they had been fighting a civilization that existed decades in the future.
September 18, 1945. The transformation began when Staff Sergeant Robert Chen, a Chinese-American interpreter fluent in Japanese, received authorization to conduct what military records termed technical orientation sessions. What followed was a systematic demonstration that would fundamentally alter the prisoner's understanding of American industrial capacity. The first session took place at 1400 hours in the camp's maintenance workshop. 15 Japanese prisoners, including former naval engineers, watched as Sergeant Chen opened the back panel of a General Electric refrigerator to reveal its internal mechanisms. The Freon 12 coolant system, hermetically sealed compressor, and electrical components represented technology that exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities by decades. Former Lieutenant Commander Kenji Watanabe, who had served aboard the battleship Yamato, provided the most detailed technical assessment.
According to his testimony, recorded in military intelligence files, Japanese naval vessels relied on ice blocks loaded at port for food preservation. The concept of mechanically produced cold, operating continuously without human intervention, challenged everything he understood about resource management and industrial efficiency. The prisoners discovered that these machines operated 24 hours daily, consuming electricity that would power an entire Japanese village for a week. Technical Sergeant Michael O'Brien, responsible for camp electrical systems, documented their reaction. When I explained that each refrigerator used approximately 300 watts continuously, the former Japanese engineers began calculating power consumption. Their faces showed what I can only describe as technological despair. The psychological impact intensified when prisoners learned about mass production statistics. Industrial records showed that American factories had produced over 3.5 million refrigerators in 1941 alone, even while simultaneously manufacturing tanks, aircraft, and ammunition. For men from a nation that had struggled to produce sufficient steel for essential military equipment, these numbers seemed impossible. The sessions revealed more than mechanical principles. Prisoners discovered that American soldiers routinely discarded food that would have been precious in Japanese forces. Leftover meals, fresh vegetables, and dairy products were disposed of daily, waste that represented abundance beyond Japanese comprehension. Master Sergeant William Torres documented the prisoners' evolving understanding. They began asking questions about American civilian life. How many families owned these machines? How much did they cost? When I explained that refrigerators were common in American homes, several prisoners requested time to process this information privately. The revelation extended beyond individual machines to industrial philosophy. American manufacturing prioritized convenience and abundance over conservation and efficiency, while Japanese engineers had focused on extracting maximum utility from minimal resources. Americans had created systems that assumed unlimited power and materials. By September 20th, camp psychologists noted significant behavioral changes. Prisoners who had maintained military discipline and pride began exhibiting what medical reports described as cognitive restructuring. They were beginning to understand that their defeat represented more than military failure. It was technological obsolescence.
September 25, 1945. The refrigerator revelation triggered what camp psychologists termed technological cascade. Once the prisoners understood the implications of American refrigeration, they began recognizing technological superiority in every aspect of camp life that they had previously taken for granted. The cascade began with electrical power. Camp Henderson operated on unlimited electricity, something the prisoners had initially assumed was temporary wartime allocation. When they learned that American civilians enjoyed constant electrical power in peacetime, the psychological impact was profound. Former Captain Yoshio Tanaka, an electrical engineer who had designed power systems for Japanese aircraft carriers, requested detailed information about American power generation. According to military intelligence reports, Tanaka's investigation revealed that American electrical production exceeded Japanese capacity by factors he initially refused to believe. The United States generated more electricity in a single month than Japan produced in an entire year. For prisoners who had witnessed their own forces operating under strict power rationing, this information suggested industrial capabilities beyond their comprehension. The revelation extended to manufacturing processes.
Prisoners learned that American refrigerator factories employed assembly line techniques that produced one complete unit every few minutes. Japanese manufacturing, even at peak wartime production, required days to complete comparable industrial equipment. The efficiency gap represented not just technological difference, but an entirely different approach to industrial organization. Medical officer Dr. Franklin Washington documented the psychological progression in his weekly report. Subjects are experiencing what appears to be systematic worldview collapse. Each new piece of information about American industrial capacity forces revision of their understanding of the war's outcome. Several prisoners have requested to understand how American civilians lived during wartime. The prisoners discovered that American rationing during wartime had been voluntary rather than survival-based. While Japanese civilians had subsisted on rice and vegetables, American families had continued consuming meat, dairy products, and fresh produce stored in millions of refrigerators. The contrast illuminated not just technological gaps, but fundamentally different concepts of wartime sacrifice. Communication records show prisoners began writing letters to families describing American technological capabilities. Censorship officers noted recurring themes: disbelief at American abundance, recognition of Japan's technological inferiority, and growing understanding that their defeat had been inevitable, given the industrial disparity. Camp Intelligence Officer Major David Thompson reported significant changes in prisoner morale and cooperation. Former resistance to interrogation has been replaced by a genuine curiosity about American society. Prisoners are requesting information about American industrial processes, educational systems, and civilian technology. They appear to be processing the reality that they fought an enemy several decades more advanced. The technological cascade reached its peak when prisoners learned about American research and development. While Japan had focused resources on immediate military needs, Americans had simultaneously developed television, radar, atomic weapons, and countless civilian technologies. The scope of American innovation suggested unlimited resources dedicated to both military victory and civilian prosperity.
October 3, 1945. The psychological transformation of Japanese prisoners reached a critical phase when they began confronting the personal implications of technological defeat. Camp medical staff documented what psychiatrist Major Helen Foster termed existential reconstruction, the painful process of rebuilding identity after fundamental beliefs proved catastrophically wrong. Former Petty Officer Masao Yamamoto,
who had served aboard submarines in the Pacific, provided the most detailed account of this psychological journey. According to his testimony, recorded for military intelligence analysis, Japanese forces had been taught that spiritual strength and tactical superiority would overcome American material advantages. The refrigerators represented proof that material advantages had been so overwhelming that spiritual strength became irrelevant. The human impact extended beyond individual prisoners to their understanding of sacrifice. These men had witnessed thousands of comrades die in battles they now realized had been hopeless from the beginning. Technical Sergeant James Mitchell, assigned to prisoner counseling, documented their struggle. They're processing the reality that their friends died not in honorable combat, but in a technological mismatch they couldn't possibly win. Medical records show increased rates of depression and what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. However, the symptoms were unique. Prisoners weren't traumatized by combat experiences, but by the revelation that their entire worldview had been based on incomplete information about enemy capabilities. Camp chaplain Captain Robert Adams conducted extensive interviews with prisoners seeking spiritual guidance. His reports describe men questioning not just military strategy, but the fundamental assumptions of Japanese society. If American civilians enjoyed technologies the Japanese military forces couldn't imagine, what did that mean about Japanese industrial development and social organization? The psychological burden was compounded by guilt. Many prisoners expressed responsibility for misleading their families about American capabilities. Letters intercepted by censors revealed their struggle to explain the technological gap without destroying their families' confidence in Japanese society's future. Dr. Foster's psychological assessments noted a phenomenon she termed technological humility. Prisoners who had maintained military pride despite defeat now exhibited deep respect for American industrial achievement. Former Lieutenant Hiroaki Sato, an aircraft maintenance officer, requested detailed information about American educational systems that produced such technological superiority. The transformation was not universal. Approximately 15% of prisoners, according to camp records, rejected the technological evidence and maintained that Japanese spiritual superiority would ultimately prevail. These men were transferred to separate housing to prevent psychological conflicts within the prisoner population. By October 10th, camp officials noted significant behavioral changes. Prisoners who had initially maintained formal military discipline began adopting American customs and expressing interest in learning English. They requested books about American history, industrial development, and civilian life. The refrigerators had become symbols of a larger revelation about the nature of modern industrial warfare. These men began understanding that they had fought not just American military forces, but American industrial civilization, a contest that had been decided before the first shot was fired.
October 26, 1945. As the first groups of Japanese prisoners prepared for repatriation, the transformation that began with refrigerators had fundamentally altered their understanding of defeat, technology, and Japan's future. What military planners had intended as simple cultural orientation had become an inadvertent demonstration of industrial superiority that would influence Japanese society for generations. Final psychological evaluations conducted by the camp's medical staff revealed the profound scope of change. Dr. Margaret Thompson, replacing Dr. Foster, documented that 85% of prisoners demonstrated what she termed technological reorientation, complete revision of their understanding of industrial development and its relationship to national power. The prisoners' repatriation interviews, preserved in military archives, reveal men who returned to Japan as inadvertent evangelists for American technological methods. Former Commander Takeshi Nakamura, the highest-ranking officer at Camp Henderson, testified that Japan's reconstruction must prioritize industrial modernization over military rebuilding. His recommendations, later incorporated into occupation planning, emphasized technology transfer and educational reform. The refrigerator demonstration had unintended strategic implications. Intelligence officers noted that repatriated prisoners became advocates for cooperation with American occupation forces, understanding that resistance would prevent Japan from accessing the technologies they had witnessed. This psychological preparation facilitated post-war reforms that might otherwise have faced greater opposition. Letters written by prisoners after repatriation, monitored by occupation authorities, described American abundance to families who struggled with post-war rationing. These accounts contributed to Japanese civilian acceptance of American-style industrial development and consumer culture that would define Japan's post-war transformation. Military historian Colonel William Hayes, documenting the camp's psychological operations, concluded that the refrigerator demonstrations had achieved more strategic impact than intended. By revealing American technological superiority in concrete, comprehensible terms, the program had created advocates for peaceful reconstruction rather than continued resistance. The individual transformations proved lasting. Follow-up studies conducted in the 1950s found that former Camp Henderson prisoners became leaders in Japan's industrial modernization. Many pursued engineering education, founded technology companies, or advocated for American industrial methods. Their direct experience with American abundance provided credibility for arguments that Japan's future lay in technological development rather than military expansion. The final irony was documented in a 1963 study by the U.S. State Department. Japan's post-war economic miracle partially resulted from lessons learned by men who had encountered American refrigerators as prisoners of war. The technology that had initially symbolized their defeat became a model for reconstruction that would eventually make Japan a technological competitor to the United States. The refrigerators at Camp Henderson had revealed more than mechanical engineering. They had demonstrated the relationship between industrial capacity and national power in ways that no military briefing could convey. The streams of cold air that preserved American food had also preserved American victory. And the Japanese prisoners who witnessed this miracle carried that lesson home to rebuild their nation according to principles they had learned as captives. Today, the site of Camp Henderson is a suburban shopping center. But the transformation that began there in 1945 continued for decades. The Japanese prisoners who once stood amazed before American refrigerators went home to build an industrial society that would eventually surpass their former captors in many technologies, a final vindication of the lessons they learned about the power of industrial innovation.